Good morning, world. Some more thoughts on Marianne Williamson and A Course in Miracles today in response to some comments that I got. And I also wanted to talk about, in general, what I have been talking about for the last few videos, and that's the idea that sadness and suffering are really morally necessary. And so I wanted to break that. I wanted to break that down in my notes next here on Jinkajabo. Now, I'm happy that Marianne Williamson is getting so much attention because I really needed to express my feelings on her philosophy, and this is something that I've been studying for a long time. I first learned about A Course in Miracles at a Quaker meeting, I believe, when I was still in college. And I didn't even begin trying it until I lived in Korea. And in Korea, I tried it online, made it through about 20 lessons, and then stopped, and didn't get through all 365 lessons until many years later out here in Vietnam. And at first I made very positive videos about it, but then as I've compared it more to other philosophies and other ideas, I found it wanting and lacking in many respects. And so one of those main respects, I guess, we have Marianne Williamson rising to power, getting on the political stage and stating that she wants to be president, and perhaps visualizing that, putting that on her vision board. When I was younger, in the 2000s, I remember The Secret. I remember the law of attraction became very hot, and a lot of this New Age thinking that if you can just will yourself to power, if you can create a vision board, make a list of things that you want to happen, that those things will happen. It's all about your mental status, and that's why you can think yourself out of any situation. Hence, we get mass shooters like, or the one mass shooter I could think of, Elliot Rodger, the incel guy, who bought The Secret and believed in the law of attraction and thought if he just willed it, if he just prayed hard enough, he could get something. It kind of ties back to Prosperity Gospel and Crystal Cathedral. Robert Schuller, a lot of these rich old evangelists back in the televangelism days. But anyway, I'm getting way sidetracked. My last video, someone pointed out respectfully that no, I didn't mean to say that Marianne Williamson was the author of A Course in Miracles. It was kind of a linguistic thing, perhaps a mistake, I guess. Looking back, I could see how it would be confusing. I meant the Course in Miracles author in the same way that you would say the science author or the cooking author. I meant it as a subject, not that she was the one who wrote the book. In fact, the one who scribed the book, Helen Schuckman, an atheist psychiatrist in New York, she claims that, the book that she channeled claimed to be the voice of Jesus. And throughout the book, it is Jesus speaking, making reference to himself, talking about the resurrection, the atonement, the crucifixion. And that's how I say that it is shrouded in Christian imagery, and that's what turns off a lot of people. They look at it and they think it's a Christian book, but then they realize, no, it is something different. It doesn't teach the same thing as Christianity. For example, I wrote down a few quotes. It talks about the journey to the cross as the last useless journey. Contrast that with Jesus telling us that we all needed to bear our cross and follow him. How is that useless if that's what he commands us to do? The Course also says that God does not hold the evil deeds of man against himself, which is completely ridiculous. If we truly believe that, then anything would be permitted. It would be like Groundhog Day. We could get away with whatever we wanted. The Bible does clearly show how even very holy men are punished for their misdeeds. I think of King David. He took Bathsheba as his wife and killed her husband, essentially. Sent her husband to the front lines in battle and got him killed. And so as punishment, God killed their child. And so there is a lot of darkness in the Bible. If you see that, atheists often will point out situations like that, like saying, this is evil, this is evil. If anything, I'd say that it points out just the reality of life as it is. And the fact is, there is such a thing as suffering and pain, and that we are responsible for it, and that we all hurt each other. Contrast that with, again, what the Course says, that you can neither hurt others nor be hurt. And this is a complete inversion and perversion of the Golden Rule. That we need to understand that we can hurt others, and we need to understand that we can be hurt. And we need to have that in our consciousness as we make moral decisions, which is why someone should not be following this book if they are going to be President of the United States. I was also critiqued on not talking about her policies, Marianne Williamson's policies, but did she talk about her policies? In fact, she said, we got all these plans, but Trump didn't win by saying he had a plan. And then she proceeded just to throw ideas on the wall, like, well, we need to do something about chemical policies and food and detainment plans. And without spelling these out. Now, I know she didn't have much time, but she could have at least thrown out something substantial for policy. And looking through all of her quotes, I went through a video that just had clips of everything she said during the debate. I could only get at two policies that she actually recommended, and one was reparations for African Americans, which, okay, you can make a case for it. I know that even Milo Yiannopoulos supported that idea, which I find crazy, because such a small minority of Americans or white people owned slaves, and the history isn't completely understood. Not only that, but we had the Civil War, and that was the most casualties, I think even surpassing World War II, that our country faced. And all these young men died to free slaves. And so I'm not sure, what about slavery that's currently happening? But I don't know if that's just pandering to her black audience. I don't see what the point is, because she's Oprah's spiritual advisor. When she appeared on Oprah in 1992, she became famous. She went from being nobody to being a Course in Miracles author, as an author on the subject of A Course in Miracles, with a very bland title for her book, A Return to Love. Okay, whatever that means. But again, okay, so she was just throwing ideas on the wall. She said pro-reparations and Green New Deal. She supports the Green New Deal, which is absolutely ridiculous. Nobody on the left even supports that. It's not even a fleshed out policy. It's just a document that just sort of went viral. It's just these AOC things. Like, she deliberately says provocative things. She might say something stupid like, oh, we need to eliminate air travel, or the world is going to end in 12 years unless we blah, 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 whatever. So it's the same rhetoric we've heard before, and I wouldn't even consider it policies because it doesn't break down specifically how any of that would be done. It's more of a wish list, but it's appropriate that Marianne Williamson would bring that up, because everything else she says is just wish list type stuff. We need to fix the chemical policies and get better food and detainment plans and all this. And her first issue, like, if she had to choose one thing, she could talk about education, she could talk about healthcare, she could talk about guns, but she just says, well, she would call the Prime Minister of New Zealand and say, we want to make America the best place to raise a kid. And again, that's not having a plan, that's not an actual policy, that's just simply a platitude. That's just saying, well, I mean, if you're going to say the best place to raise a kid, do you mean education? Do you mean health? Do you mean doing something about violence? Doing something about obesity? If you could only choose one thing. But it's this idea that, okay, you can just take everything. You believe in love, then somehow magically, metaphysically, it'll all happen. It's this Course in Miracles bullshit idea that you can just, if you really want something, and if you really feel it in your heart, and if you feel love, and if you trust God, then it will all come true. Now let us consider the dark side, and this is what I called contingency in my last video, or my video about Marianne Williamson, meaning that we can never see what's around the corner. Now, A Course in Miracles, if I understand it, does reference this. It does say that things will happen that you can't predict, but it also says that you just have to keep hammering out your thoughts. and that it's really your responsibility. Like the whole world we see is because of us. Good things and the bad things. It all is tied back to our perceptions. So then the problem with the course, which I experienced during the year that I was taking the lessons, is that when things would go wrong, you take the blame for it yourselves. You don't just see the world as it is, that just things happen. You think, well, it's because my thinking was off. I wasn't praying hard enough. I didn't do the lesson well enough. This is why these bad things are happening. And this is why I can't get over this stuff. Rather than just yielding to what is, in fact, the reality of the universe, what is understood by most of the world religions, and not this Gnostic New Age stuff. Sadness is salutary. Sadness is necessary. We don't change. We cannot grow without experiencing pain. You know, as kids, we get taller, our bones hurt as we sleep. You know, it's just part of who we are. When you study for a really difficult exam, or when you get a degree, right, you have to go through all these tests, and it's a lot of late nights, and it's a lot of reading stuff that you don't want to read. Exercise, okay? If I were to lose weight, and I keep telling myself that I'm going to, but I don't. And why don't I? Because it's hard to get up in the morning and run around. That's very painful. That sort of growth involves pain. As far as suffering, even Jesus, who claim to be the author of the Course, but it's just using Jesus. I mean, they have all sorts of different ways to justify that. Like, well, it's Jesus, but only because that's the voice that people will understand in this era, or whatever. But if we look at the Bible, the shortest verse in the Bible, in the Gospel of John, is simply, Jesus wept. And there are many accounts of him suffering, of him feeling sadness, of him feeling angry. And yet there was some peace underlying it. He did understand the outcome of things. But like all of us, he suffered temptation. And whereas we succumb to our temptations, we ease that pain by doing that wrong thing. Like, he didn't do any of those wrong things. He took so much abuse, and that abuse was manifested 1,000-fold because there was no relief. There was no sense of just giving into temptation and just doing evil to help himself through. Because to be good and to do good requires us to suffer and to feel pain. Consider the first noble truth of Buddhism. If Jesus is not your homeboy, if Jesus is not your guy, think of Buddhism. What is the first noble truth? Life is suffering. Life is suffering. That's the very first basic teaching in Buddhism. Now, there are ways to cope with that suffering. That's what the whole Dharma is about. That's what the other remaining noble truths are about. But we have to understand from the very beginning in the Buddhist teaching that life is indeed suffering. Life is pain. And that's not a lamentation. That's just a statement of fact. I'll leave you with the last words of Vincent van Gogh, who died when he was 37 years old from a self-inflicted gunshot. And this happened much later in the hospital when he was dying from an infection. It wasn't automatic. It wasn't just like he snapped out, but he suffered in bed after that shot, knowing that he was slowly dying and that he didn't have much time left. And his last words to his brother Theo were, the last thing he said to his brother Theo was, "The sadness never ends." Now, let me ask you, do you think we would have the starry night without that sadness? Over and out.